to the behavior support CSR that was implemented in March of this year, or last year, sorry, March of 2020. If you all recall, in August of last year in 2020, we did a series of webinars covering the CSR as we slowly implemented it in the midst of the pandemic, and we're still slowly coming out of the pandemic. And so we still continue to implement and make sure people understand that we do have a CSR now that covers behavior supports in Missouri. It's 9 CSR 45 3.090, which replaces our old directive on restrictive interventions, reactive strategies, which was 4.300. If you were familiar with that directive, then you will be very familiar with the language in the CSR. So I'm being told by my colleague Melantha that people may be having trouble getting in. So I'm going to pause for 2 minutes just to make sure people can get in if they need to, and then we'll continue. So I apologize. Again, this is a refresher on the prohibited procedures as defined in the CSR and defined elsewhere for the number of years. So again, this is a review of some of the things that are outlined in the CSR. You see the CSR at the top, which is for your reference. And if you haven't read it, please do. There's a lot of stuff in there that's beyond prohibited practices, but today we're specifically going to be talking about prohibited practices. So as I mentioned, effective July 1st of this year, so in 15 days, we will no longer be conditionally approving exclusion timeout as an intervention for use in our setting. So just for everybody's awareness, this is the definition that's in the CSR. I'm going to quickly read through it because it is really important to understand specifically what we consider seclusion timeout. So anytime you're secluding a person alone in a location for a period of time set by someone other than the person, so it's not the person deciding they want to just go be by themselves for a while. Somebody else is saying they have to be alone in a location for some time. And it cannot be used as programmatic or an emergency intervention. And if it is found, then there's a special review process, which we'll talk about in a few slides, on follow-up actions that have to be completed by the regional office and the area behavior analyst. And the reason why July 1st is kind of that magic date is it's outlined in the CSR, but it's also outlined in our Medicaid waiver application, where we've described to CMS that as of July 1st, which is the next waiver renewal, it will be added to the list of our prohibited practices, and we will no longer do it. Prior to July 1st of 2021, we did have a special process by which you could get approval under some very high scrutiny circumstances to use it with comprehensive behavior services, but that will no longer be possible come July 1st. If you need more information about a situation that you think might be exclusion timeout, or if you currently are using exclusion timeout, hopefully you're already working with your area behavior analyst, but if you're not, please reach out to them immediately. There is a link on these slides, which you will have a copy of after today's presentation, that will take you to the list of contacts. There are currently 3 area behavior analysts in the state. There's the central area behavior analyst, myself, Luke Sevens. And in the eastern side of the state, we have Melantha Witherspoon, eastern area behavior analyst. And then in the west, we have Rita Cooper, who you can contact if you are on the western side of the state. There are other prohibited practices or procedures that have been established for more than a decade in directive and CSR. It's not just exclusion timeout. We're going to go through some of those now. So we have a whole list of prohibited procedures. It's not just exclusion timeout. So we just want to make sure everybody is aware what those are. And again, these aren't new. So the CSR didn't establish them for the first time. They've been well established in various places for a very, very long time, including another CSR. Anytime you are restraining somebody when they're on their stomach or on their back, basically on the ground restraints, or you're using a wall to restrain them, so you're pressing against a wall or an object, that is considered a prohibited practice. Anytime you are laying on top of or sitting on top of a person, that would be a prohibited procedure. And when you're hyperextending people's joints to get them to submit, that would be prohibited as well. And then anytime you're using a modification of a technique or a system that hasn't been explicitly approved by the division, that includes uh, division approved training for the implementer. So it's not enough to say that now we use, this cool system that's been approved. You have to actually have um, an approved training curriculum that goes with it in order to use it and not be prohibited. And then also mechanical restraints have and continue to be prohibited practices in our settings. And you should see the specific definition in the rule. There are some exceptions like uh, devices that are used during medical procedures to hold people still, or like a cast that a person would wear to hold limb in a certain position so it can heal. Those things are not mechanical restraints, but there are other things that are. We'll look at some specific examples that people don't often realize in a couple slides. Anytime you're doing something that may make somebody's medical or physical condition worse, or is just generally medically contraindicated, or basically endangers the person's life, that's prohibited. We don't do any techniques that interfere with people's breathing, or we don't cover people's faces. So, for example, you can't put a pillow over a person's face because they're spitting on you, or because um, they are biting or trying to headbutt you. Can't place a pillow over their face. Anytime you're doing something, a reactive strategy or a restrictive intervention on an as needed basis, which means you can't have a standing order for whatever. Like there has to be. I do not know what I just did. Sorry about that. Kat, can you help me?
Yep, you should have it now. Again.
It's showing me a whiteboard. Oh, there it goes. Okay. Can you confirm that you can see the slides now?
Yes.
Perfect. Sorry about that. I somehow got a whiteboard and I didn't mean to do that. Okay. Continuing on. Um, a comprehensive safety crisis plan that would outline situations in which a physical intervention would be indicated, provided the staff are trained, competency trained in the use of that intervention, and the intervention is part of a system that's been approved by the division, is not considered as needed reactive strategy or restrictive intervention. That's considered best practice, actually. But what this is really referring to is you just can't have standing orders for restraints. Um, it, it needs to be part of a comprehensive plan. There needs to be lots of proactive, preventative things, and there needs to be opportunities to kind of assess what's happening. And so you can't just have, when Johnny screams, Johnny gets, manually restrained and taken somewhere. That's prohibited. Anytime you're doing things as punishment for the convenience of staff, or as an substitute for, treatment or active engagement or good quality of life, or as a substitute for behavior services, that is prohibited. You can't use law enforcement or EMTs or paramedics um, as the reactive strategy for addressing problem behavior. So this can't be documented in the ISP or the behavior support plan as as the strategies you're using to eliminate or reduce problem behaviors. So what this doesn't mean is that uh, an agency can't have a policy for what they will do in an emergency, just generally in an emergency, that they would contact emergency authorities. What it does mean is that can't be your individualized strategy for a person. And it can't be your standard intervention for behavioral management or control or uh, reactive strategies. So if you're an agency and what you do when people become upset is call the cops, and people become upset all the time, that seems like a standard practice at this point, and you should be thinking about other things that you can do. Standard use of emergency departments for reactive strategies for out of control behavior um, is a prohibited practice. And then finally, anytime you're using another person that you support at your agency to administer reactive strategies, that would be also prohibited. So we don't use housemates to help restrain people. That's just not something that we do. Next slide. We don't use corporal punishment. We don't use aversive conditioning. We don't use overcorrection. We don't use contingent exercise. We don't put people in totally enclosed cribs. We don't put people in jail cells. And we don't do anything that is prohibited under state or federal statute. So now we have a challenge question. So thinking about all of those prohibited practices that I just went through, which of the following are prohibited in Missouri? And this is a multi-select, so there could be more than one answer. Okay, let's see what you responded. Looks like most people didn't answer. So going forward, try to answer, even if you're not sure. I'm getting feedback that you couldn't multi-select. Fair enough. Okay, so let's go through each one of these in the chat. So which one of these people in the chat do you think are prohibited practices? You can just list the letters in the chat. A, B, C, D, E, all of the above, some of them. What do you all think? Okay, I've gotten a couple responses. I'm going to get a couple more before I move on. So I've gotten a mix between all of the above, A, B, D, and E, D, and E. So let's go through these. So the first one is prohibited because anytime you're doing a modification to a system that's not been approved by the division, you're not using division approved training, then that is prohibited. Mechanical restraints are always prohibited. So it's definitely B. Now C, crisis management curriculum that other than MANT and CPI isn't necessarily prohibited unless it hasn't been approved. So we have a set of crisis management systems that have been pre-approved, and we also have a process for approving modifications or different systems. And if you're using a different system that has been approved, so approved means you've gotten approval before you're using it, then that's not prohibited. If you are using something that hasn't been reviewed and approved by the division and by the chief behavior analyst, then that is prohibited. D is definitely a prohibited practice. Anytime you're doing something that makes somebody's medical or physical condition worse, you are engaging in prohibited practices. And then definitely E as well. Anytime you're covering somebody's face, so that can interfere with breathing, so that's definitely prohibited. The next one is another challenge question, and this one does have hopefully the ability to only select one and it be correct. It says, which of these is probably an example of a mechanical restraint? And if people have questions about this, we can spend some time and talk about it, but let's see first what people answer. Okay, got about 9 seconds left, and then we'll look at the results. All right, let's see what people answered. So it looks like of those that responded, most of you indicated that it's all of the above, and then um, most of the rest of you indicated that it was B, C, and D, and a few picked out the special seatbelts. So the correct answer to this one is all of the above. So when you lock people inside their house for the purpose of keeping them there, and they can't unlock and get out, that is a mechanical restraint. That's the way that it is being viewed currently, and the way we've been operating for the last probably 2 years. DMH Legal Counsel reviewed our definitions of mechanical restraint and said that that situation met that definition, so that's what we're following. If taking away crutches from a person who needs them to walk, you're basically removing their ability to move from location to location. That's considered a mechanical restraint, as is taking power mechanisms from a wheelchair for the exact same reasons. So in the event that a person is driving their wheelchair in places that you don't want them to go, so you just turn their wheelchair off, effectively making them unable to move from that location, you have just effectively uh, implemented a mechanical restraint. And same thing with the seat belts on the wheelchairs. If people can't get out of the chair because when they want to, um, that's not an aid to keep them safe when they're moving from place to place. It's not an aid to keep them in the right position. That's a restraint to keep them in their chair, and it is a device, so we're considering that a mechanical restraint as well. Which of the following is considered exclusion timeout and is prohibited? So we've got 3 situations indicated here in a question. Read through them and determine which one do you think is a exclusion timeout. So if you feel like there are multiple answers, go ahead and put in the chat which letters you think are the right ones. So we've got some folks have indicated AB, ABC, ABCD, ABD. So let's go through these. So I would say each one could potentially be exclusion timeout. Some are more obviously exclusion timeout than others. So let's kind of go through each one of these. If you have a room that you put a person in when dangerous behavior occurs and you make them stay there until they're calm, that's obviously exclusion timeout. It very cleanly fits the definition of exclusion timeout, as does a room that you used is used by staff for out of control behavior, and the person has to stay there. It doesn't really matter what you call it. You can call it, and as in this example, a snoozlin room, and B, you can call it a calm room, a safe room, a zen room, a chill room, a bedroom. It really doesn't matter the word that you choose to refer to the room. What matters is what you do with it. So if you have a room that you make people go to and you make them stay there until they're calm, which means they can't choose to leave and they're alone inside the room, that is exclusion timeout. Same thing with D. If you don't physically relocate a person to a room, but you essentially create the seclusion room around them by making everybody else leave and preventing that person from leaving and making them stay in there for 15 minutes by themselves, that is also seclusion timeout. Even though you haven't taken them anywhere, you've effectively made the seclusion room around them. Now, C is a little bit harder because it depends. So if you are asking a person to go to their bedroom and calm down, and you're kind of letting them know that they should do that until you decide they are calm, this is a little bit suspicious. So one of the key words is until you decide is a little concerning because part of the definition of seclusion timeout is that the staff are controlling when people stay in. And then there's actually another question that I would ask in this situation on C is what would happen if they decided to leave? So if you ask a person to go to their bedroom to calm down, and the implication is they have to go until you say they can leave. And what I mean by implication is if they don't listen to what you say, you make them go, or if they don't stay in until you tell them they can come out, you put them back in. That is seclusion timeout as well. Now, if you are suggesting that somebody go take a breather in their bedroom or a side room, like the dining room when everybody else is in the living room, or the kitchen when everybody else is in the living room, or the living room, vice versa, doesn't really matter. And they say, no, I don't want to. And you're like, that's cool, that's fine. That's not exclusion timeout. So coaching people to use skills, suggesting people take some space by them, take some time by themselves to calm down is not exclusion timeout. It's when you make them do it when they don't want to, and when you make them stay when they want to leave and they're alone in the room. That's when it's exclusion timeout. Okay, next question. Which of the following is true? So thank you, those that have continued to be flexible and are chatting in the responses to the questions. I really appreciate that. So there are two true responses on here. So let's kind of go through them. So we'll go through them each one at a time. So the first one, as long as you don't call it timeout, you can use a room to hold somebody inside alone until you think they're safe to come out. Is that true or false? That's false. That is not accurate. You cannot. It doesn't matter what you call it. It's what you do with it. So if you're using a room in that manner, it's timeout, regardless of what you call it. B, if you are keeping a person in their bedroom until you think they can interact appropriately, you are using timeout procedure. True. That is a true statement. If a person is required to stay in the living room while staff and roommates cook dinner, oh, this one is also true. It might be a timeout procedure, and it should say might be prohibited. So this is if you remember back to the question we just answered, if you kind of create a seclusion, if you create a seclusion timeout room or a timeout room around a person, it's still the same thing. So if you are making a person stay by themselves alone while everybody else goes into the kitchen and cooks dinner and they can't leave that room, that that likely is exclusion timeout and it would be prohibited in that circumstance. So um, I would say for C, it would be a little bit less confusing if it said if it might be prohibited. So if it might be a timeout procedure and it might be prohibited if it were a timeout procedure. Um, so C is also true with the addition of the caveat. And then D, if a person chooses to go to their bedroom and stay there until they feel like being with others, there's not a suggestion made by staff or there's no requirement that they do it, then it's not considered timeout. That is true as well. So just to recap on this one, if you keep somebody in the room until they can interact appropriately, your using timeout procedure is true. If the person is required to stay in the living room while staff and roommates cook dinner, so they're alone in the living room, yeah, that might be a timeout procedure. And if it were a timeout procedure, it would be prohibited. And if somebody just wants to go be alone in their room until they feel like being around other people and there's no requirement from staff that they do that, then that's not considered timeout. All right, so let's move on from questions. So you guys get a break from answering questions, and I'm going to go through what the review process is in the event that some prohibited practice or unauthorized procedures are discovered. So the first thing that happens is that the relevant regional director, so wherever the event occurs, the regional director that covers that area should be notified, as should be the agency that is involved with the incident, the person who experienced the procedure, and there needs to be identified why it was used. And at this point, the regional director will inform the regional staff and the area behavior analyst that they need to do a special focus review of the agency. This is to kind of assess whether it is indeed a prohibited practice, and then start to work on the process of how to address the discontinuation of it or prevent it from happening again, basically to remediate the situation so there's no longer prohibited practices occurring. And obviously, once the area behavior analyst has completed their focus review, then they will inform the regional office, including the regional director and staff, as well as the rest of the team, such as the provider, the support coordinator, the guardian, the person, what the findings were, which in the event that there's a prohibited practice, it would also include the next steps that are required to be taken in the process of remediating the situation. Which is the next step. So the area behavior analyst will become involved individually with the person and the team to determine what needs to happen to remove the need for the prohibited practice in the future, including whether or not additional services might be necessary, like behavior services, medical consultations, OT or PT evaluations, and then we'll work with the provider to develop and implement some positive, proactive, and preventative strategies. Again, trying to prevent the need for the prohibited practice or to fade the need for the prohibited practice if there's a continued need for it. And when the area behavior analyst will also refer individuals and their teams to the behavior support review committee, and they are required to attend, and that's part of the follow-up process as well. And there will also be, in addition to the behavior support review committee, follow-up reviews with the provider to make sure that those strategies and procedures that the ABA works with the team to develop are being utilized and that the prohibited practices are being fully discontinued. And the duration of the follow-up really will just be determined on a case-by-case basis by the chief behavior analyst, really just based on the circumstance of the individual situation. And that's the extent of the slides. I apologize, Dr. Rogers wasn't able to make it. We have a lot of times for questions. I will do my best to answer them, and if I can't answer them, I will record them and take them back, and then we will get them answered, and a supplemental document will go out with the slides in a couple days. So what questions are out there lingering for folks? Well, I have a question for you all. Do you all feel like you have a pretty good handle on what things are prohibited? Do you think you can identify some common situations that would be prohibited? Uh, we have one question that's not related to this. Mark, send me an email and I will answer that. Another question was, when does this go into effect? Immediately. So the answer to that question is this already is in effect. So these prohibited practices have been prohibited for a very, very long time. They're tied to a couple CSRs, some directives, and part of our operating procedures for a very long time. The only thing that's different, and it's just barely different, is that July 1st, seclusion timeout will no longer be an approvable practice under any circumstance. So before, if you were using seclusion timeout and it hadn't been pre-approved by the chief behavior analyst, which means that there was ongoing behavior services and there was a functional assessment completed that identified that there was a need for the seclusion timeout procedure, that was reviewed by the behavior support review committee and approved, and then subsequently reviewed and approved by the chief behavior analyst. Unless that had happened, it was already prohibited to use seclusion timeout. The only thing different July 1st is there will no longer be that special approval process. So under no circumstances can we conditionally approve the use of seclusion timeout. But other than that, everything is what has been in place for a very long time. This is just a refresher to make sure people understand what the requirements are.
Hey, Lucas, I'm going to go ahead and read some of these because some of the questions went directly to me instead of to
Oh,
you.
got it.
So I'm going to read them out to you. As soon as I can open that up. Give me one sec. Okay, one is if you have individuals doing an activity and someone begins to have a behavior, you remove others to safety. This is considered seclusion, and that's a question mark.
Yeah, so that's a good question, Tiffany. And so the key things to remember is if somebody is engaging in unsafe behavior and everybody else leaves and the person can't leave, so they have to stay there alone until they're safe and staff are determining when they're safe, like that is seclusion. So if you're sitting around the living room coffee table and one of the individuals starts breaking a chair and everybody just gets up and walks out, but the person's not being made to stay there, that's not seclusion timeout because they can freely go wherever they want around the house. When it becomes seclusion timeout is if everybody gets up and leaves the room and then staff make the person stay in that room by themselves until they're safe, until they're calm. That would be seclusion timeout.
Okay, what if parents want to use any of these prohibited procedures?
Well, I would prefer that they didn't. And if parents want to use these procedures with their children and we don't fund any services that would be involved in the use of the practice, then we would strongly recommend that they don't, but we don't really have any authority or say over, what they would do as parents with their children, so long as it doesn't reach the point of being abuse, at which point, there's a process for that. But if it's waiver funded services or Medicaid funded services, anything that we fund or we have paid for staff that are implementing these procedures, they can't be used regardless of whether the parents want to use them, whether the guardian wants to use them. It doesn't matter. You can't use them. If parents or family members want to use them with their own family in situations where there's no funding for any of the service or the setting, that's really up to them. We would prefer they didn't do that.
Okay, if a doctor has authorized and recommended PRN medication to manage behaviors, is that still prohibited?
The only time that it would be potentially prohibited is when it would be considered a chemical restraint. Chemical restraint would be, and do not quote me, please go back to the CSR to look at the definition because I don't have it memorized, but essentially if the medication is rendering the person unconscious, unable to move, unable to stand up, like that would be considered a chemical restraint and that could be prohibited. So I would definitely follow up with that. If the medication is something that's supposed to help allow the person to function as they wish, So like, for example, they get nervous when they go to a dentist appointment, and so the doctor has prescribed Ativan for use prior to the appointment. They take it, they're able to successfully go to the appointment, get their dental work done. That's not prohibited. That's probably not even a restrictive intervention. But if a person is being given medication to control their behavior that makes them unconscious or unable to function, that would be a chemical restraint and is prohibited.
Okay. Are the rules the same for state schools? Does this apply to timeout before July 1st,
This
2021?
Yeah, this does not apply to state schools at all. They are governed by a different set of regulations. This only applies to uh, the DD system, so Medicaid waiver and Medicaid community service. So not regular schools, not state schools, not education institutions. This is not part of their guiding requirements.
Okay. How do you keep everyone safe in the house if an individual is acting inappropriately? That's if you can't remove them.
Yeah, so that's a really great question, and that would be a conversation for the treatment team to sit down and determine whether they need help from a behavior analyst, whether they need to look into some other intensive services like therapy, what the safety crisis plan says. So that's not a question I can really answer right here, but that definitely is an opportunity to determine whether there are additional services needed. And the behavior analyst or the therapist or um, ideally the treatment team of all the people that support the person should be able to sit down and come up with some strategies to help with that.
Okay. This person is saying, I do understand these rules, but what do you do in a group setting when others will get hurt by a person's behaviors if you cannot remove him from a room and you cannot remove others from a room?
So just to be clear, I didn't say, and it doesn't say that you can't remove people from a situation. What it says is you can't take somebody and put them alone in a room and make them stay there until you think that they are calm to go out. So uh, if you are in a group setting and a person is becoming unsafe and you ask housemates to leave and they leave and the person is there um, destroying things, then that's not necessarily prohibited. When it becomes prohibited is if you take everybody else out of the room and you make them stay by holding the door shut or by physically putting them back in the room each time they try to leave until they're calm. That's when it becomes seclusion timeout. Um, Now that's um, a really serious situation that you're describing. And again, that's when the treatment team and the planning team should come together and determine what additional services are necessary, because that's a really unsafe situation. And we should be working on what skills and strategies can be put into place to make that situation less likely to happen and for staff to have training on what to do in the event that it does occur.
Have the providers already been notified that I'm sorry, the question's a little off. Have the providers already been notified that they cannot be conditionally approved now?
So to my knowledge, yes, that has already happened. We did 2 webinars in August of last year that were recorded and are available right now on the new CSR and the impending change July 1st. And again, the only people that this really impacts are a handful of people that have gone through the special process to be conditionally approved, which is like 0.1% of all people in our system, probably less than that. And so again, if you're using exclusion timeout and it hadn't been approved, it was already prohibited even before July 1st.
What if ISL providers are refusing to continue to support a person because locks on the doors are too unsafe to be taken off?
Well, I mean, I I think that's a determination that a ISL provider would need to make. I think that if a person is currently needing locks on their door to remain safe, to keep them inside the house, and that team should reach out to the area behavior analyst immediately to begin working on alternatives to needing the locks. We have worked with many teams over the last couple years to slowly fade the use of the locks out so that they can be taken away eventually safely, but the person can continue to still be safe and learn skills inside their home so that they can live a better life and the teams can come into compliance with division requirements. But ultimately, an ISL provider may determine that, given these prohibited practices that we have in place, that they may not be equipped to support people with certain needs.
Okay, not timeout related to timeout, but wanted to ask a question about remote monitoring. Cameras were not listed as a prohibited practice, but I just wanted to verify that the use for a camera to monitor someone in their room or home area so that they can have alone time or be monitored for seizures, example, we would send through due process for rights restrictions and require a SCP, but would this need to be reviewed by Behavioral Resource Committee?
It wouldn't necessarily need to be reviewed by the Behavior Support Review Committee, but I'm so glad that you identified that it needs to go through the due process committee so they can make sure that all those elements of due process are in place.
Do these rules apply to adult daycare?
If the adult daycare is funded through Medicaid waiver or Medicaid, then yes. So if it's an alternative funded activity that's not related to a TCM service that's being provided or some contracted service provider in our system, then it doesn't apply. But if it does, if the daycare is happening at a provider that's contracted with us to provide services and we're paying for it, then yeah, it applies.
Is there a way to get a group of behavioral analysts together who all have individuals still needing time out to work on intervention ideas, etc.?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And if there's interest in that, we could dedicate an entire Behavior Support Review Committee session for just that topic. So reach out to me or your area behavior analyst if that's is of interest to you. I think that's a good idea, Allison. So please, folks, reach out if that would be something you want to participate in, and we can make that happen.
Regarding the notification process, if staff at an agency engage in seclusion timeout against the recommendations of a BCBA, who must be the reporter to the area behavioral analysis?
I would say that anyone who identifies that it's an issue is responsible to report it to the regional office and the area behavior analyst. So I don't know what to say other than if you see something that's prohibited, you should report it.
It looks to be it, Lucas.
Excellent. Okay. Well, I'll hang out here for a few more minutes, and if people have more questions, I will answer them. You all, thank you so much for being very flexible and eager and engaging participants. If you have additional questions after this session is over, you are encouraged to reach out to your area behavior analyst to get some consultation around those things. And hopefully this was helpful, and I hope people are feeling a little bit more comfortable with what is prohibited and what changes are coming in the next month. Thank you all.